Imagine stepping onto a plane, dressed in your comfiest hoodie, just trying to get from point A to point B, when suddenly the whispers start. Snide comments, judgmental glances, laughter that cuts deeper than you'd like to admit. Now picture this. Beneath that ordinary exterior lies a story so extraordinary, it turns mockery into awe and leaves everyone questioning their assumptions. Welcome to the Jones Life Stories, where we uncover real-life dramas, heart-pounding twists, and lessons that light a fire in your soul. If you've ever felt underestimated, overlooked, or judged for how you look, this story is for you. Stick with us, because by the end, you'll be inspired to embrace your true self, no matter what the world throws your way. Before we dive in, do me a quick favor, grab your phone, smash that like button, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, and hit subscribe to the Jones Life Stories for more tales that remind you your worth isn't defined by appearances. Let's soar into Rachel Monroe's incredible journey. Rachel Monroe's fingers were steady as she tucked her boarding pass into the pocket of her faded gray hoodie. The Seattle airport was a chaotic blur. Endless security lines, the incessant beep of scanners, and travelers dragging suitcases like they were racing against time. The jet bridge to the Washington, D.C.-bound flight felt like a tunnel to another world, the air thick with the scent of overpriced coffee and the faint tang of jet fuel wafting in from the tarmac. Her hoodie, once a deep charcoal, was now threadbare at the elbows, the cuffs frayed from years of rough use. Her jeans, bought on clearance, had a small tear at the knee, not a fashion statement, but a relic from a training exercise where she'd scaled a fence under pressure. Rachel wasn't dressed to impress. She was dressed for the mission ahead, one that required her to blend in, not stand out. As she stepped into the business class cabin, the contrast hit her like a gust of wind. The seats were plush, wide, with legroom that screamed luxury. Sleek leather carry-ons, branded with logos she'd only glimpsed in glossy ads, lined the overhead bins like trophies. A woman in a sharp blazer, her gold earrings glinting under the cabin lights, looked up from her smartphone. Her name tag read Olivia Hart, and her quick, dismissive smirk told Rachel everything she needed to know. Olivia had already decided she didn't belong. Next to her, a man in a pinstriped suit, his tie knotted with precision, leaned toward his seatmate, a guy with a slick haircut and gold cufflinks that screamed inherited wealth. "Looks like she got lost on her way to the bus station," the pinstriped man muttered, his voice loud enough for Rachel to catch. His name was Richard Hale, and his tone carried the weight of someone used to being heard. Rachel didn't flinch. Her steps remained even, her eyes fixed on the row numbers glowing above the seats, 10A, 11B, until she reached 12F, her window seat. She wasn't here to prove anything to these strangers. Life had taught her that the battles worth fighting weren't won in airplane cabins with words or glares. Her fights had been in the skies, where split-second decisions meant the difference between life and death. Today, she just needed to get to D.C. for a meeting that could either change everything or fade into the background of her quiet, post-service life. The cabin buzzed with the self-assured energy of people who believe they own the space they occupied. Business-class passengers sipped complimentary mimosas, their laughter sharp and confident, bouncing off the curved walls like they were performing for an audience. Rachel slid into 12F, tucking her worn backpack under the seat in front. It was an old thing, army green, with a faded patch from a base she hadn't seen in years, the threads unraveling like memories she kept buried. The man next to her, mid-40s with a Rolex that gleamed like a status symbol, gave her a quick once-over. His name tag read Richard Hale, and his cologne, a heavy mix of sandalwood and arrogance, made her blink to clear her eyes. He turned back to his tablet, pretending to focus on a spreadsheet, but Rachel could feel his sidelong glances, trying to figure out why she didn't fit his worldview. She didn't care. Judgment was an old acquaintance, one she'd met in briefing rooms, on tarmacs, and in the eyes of superiors who doubted a young woman could handle a fighter jet. Her dark, wavy hair was pulled back in a loose ponytail, strands escaping from the wind outside the terminal. Her face was bare, no makeup to hide the faint scar along her jaw, a memento from an ejection seat malfunction during a training flight years ago. To the casual observer, she looked like a college kid scraping by, maybe someone who'd snagged a last-minute deal on a budget airline app. But Rachel Monroe was no ordinary traveler. Her classified file, locked in a Pentagon vault, listed her as a reserve recruit. It didn't mention the covert mission she'd flown for SEAL Team 6, navigating through enemy radar like a ghost in the night. It didn't detail the honorable discharge that followed a mission gone sideways, one that saved lives but left whispers in its wake. Hey, pause for a moment. If this story's already hitting you, if you've ever walked into a room and felt eyes judging you before you could even speak, drop a comment below. Tell me where you're watching from. Is it your morning coffee run, or are you curled up late at night? Here at the Jones Life Stories, we believe in turning moments of doubt into fuel for greatness. Every underdog has a comeback story waiting to unfold. Like this video if it's sparking something in you. Share it with a friend who needs a reminder of their strength, and subscribe for more tales that prove your past doesn't define you, but your resilience does. Let's keep going with Rachel's story. As Rachel settled into her seat, a young woman in a sleek black dress leaned forward from the row behind. Her hair was styled in perfect waves, likely fresh from a high-end salon, and her name tag read Jessica Lang. Her voice carried a practiced sweetness, the kind that masked a sharper edge, like honey over a blade. "You must be so excited to be on a plane like this," Jessica said, her tone dripping with faux pity, as if Rachel were a charity case who'd never flown before. Heads turned subtly, catching the comment, and a soft ripple of laughter spread through the cabin, a wave of superiority that seemed to bond the passengers in their shared judgment. Rachel's fingers paused on her water bottle, her thumb brushing the cap in a slow, deliberate circle. She turned slightly, her green eyes meeting Jessica's for a brief, unflinching moment. There was no anger in her gaze, just a quiet strength that seemed to unsettle the woman. "It's just a flight," Rachel replied, her voice quiet but steady, like a stone dropping into still water, creating ripples that lingered. Jessica's smile faltered, her perfectly manicured hand flipping her hair with a huff as she sat back, cheeks flushing under her foundation. The laughter died down, replaced by an awkward shuffle of papers and adjusted seats. Rachel turned back to the window, her expression unchanged, but her grip on the bottle tightened just enough to crease the plastic. A memory flickered, a dusty airfield in the Middle East, the roar of engines drowning out the chaos below. She'd been 22, fresh out of flight school, piloting a stealth fighter through a storm of anti-aircraft fire. Her squadron had called her ability to strike unseen in the dark. That night, she'd lost a wingman but saved the rest, guiding them through a gauntlet of missiles. The scar on her jaw was from that ejection, but the deeper wounds were invisible, teaching her patience in the face of pettiness like this. The plane hadn't even begun to taxi when the first overt jab landed. Olivia Hart, the head flight attendant, stood at the front of the cabin like a gatekeeper. Her uniform was pressed to perfection, not a wrinkle in sight, and her smile was tight, professional, but her eyes were sharp, sizing people up in seconds and filing them away as worthy or not. She'd taken one look at Rachel's boarding pass during check-in and decided her fate. "Economy class in the back," Olivia announced over the intercom, her words laced with just enough disdain to sting, drawing chuckles from a few passengers who nodded knowingly as if Rachel's presence was an inconvenience. Richard Hale leaned over to his friend, the one with the slick haircut and gold cufflinks, whose name tag read Mark Ellison. "Probably one of those discount ticket people," Richard said, not bothering to lower his voice, his tone carrying across the aisle like an unwelcome breeze. Rachel's fingers paused on her backpack zipper, just for a moment, before she continued stowing her items, slow and deliberate, as if counting her breaths to stay centered. A woman across the aisle, her nails painted a glossy red that matched her lipstick, snickered softly. Her name was Tara Wells, and she exuded the confidence of someone used to getting her way, perhaps an influencer, judging by the designer phone case she clutched like a status symbol. Rachel didn't look up. She adjusted her seatbelt, clicking it into place with hands that were steady despite the rising tension. Those hands were calloused from years of gripping flight controls, pulling G-forces that would make most people black out. She'd flown F-22 Raptors in simulations that felt more real than this cabin ever could. But here, she was just the girl in the hoodie, an easy target for their boredom. As the plane pushed back from the gate and taxied toward the runway, the engines humming to life, Rachel gazed out the window. The ground crew waved their orange ones, the tarmac glistening under the Seattle rain that had just stopped. Clouds rolled past like distant waves, and for a moment, she allowed herself to drift. Her life hadn't always been this, flying commercial, blending into the crowd. There was a time when she was at the controls, soaring at Mach 2, her world a blur of blue sky and adrenaline. But after that final mission, where she disobeyed a direct order to save her team, the brass had quietly ushered her out. Honorable discharge. They called it, but it felt like exile. Now, she was a consultant, called in for classified briefings, her expertise hidden behind nondescript clothes and a low profile. Tara Wells leaned toward her friend, a blonde in a silk scarf who smelled of lavender and vanilla, expensive perfume that lingered. Her name tag read Claire Donovan. "Bet she's scared sitting near the emergency exit," Tara whispered, her smirk sharp enough to cut glass, her voice just loud enough to reach Rachel's ears. Rachel's lips curved into a faint smile, but she didn't turn her head. She reached for her water bottle, unscrewing the cap with a slow, deliberate twist, a calming ritual from her pilot days, focusing on the small things when the big ones threatened to overwhelm. Claire's laughter was sharp, echoing in the confined space, drawing a few more glances. Rachel stayed quiet, her eyes on the horizon as the plane accelerated down the runway, lifting off with a gentle tilt that pressed her back into the seat. "Hey, let's take a quick break." If Rachel's calm under pressure is resonating with you, if you've ever had to bite your tongue when someone tried to make you feel small, let me know in the comments. Where are you right now? At home, on a break, or maybe on a plane yourself? Here at the Jones Life Stories, we're all about stories that lift you up, that remind you of your inner strength. If this is hitting home, hit that like button, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more tales that inspire you to keep pushing forward. All right, back to the flight. During the meal service, the aroma of gourmet food filled the cabin: seared salmon, fresh salads, warm bread rolls. Olivia paused by Rachel's row, holding a tray of business-class menus printed on thick, embossed paper. She glanced at Rachel's hoodie, her eyes lingering on the frayed cuffs, then handed the menu to Richard Hale with a warm, genuine smile. "I'm sorry, we only have enough for our premium passengers," Olivia said, her voice loud enough to carry, her eyes flicking to Rachel with a hint of superiority, as if to say, "Know your place." A man 2 rows ahead, in a tailored blazer, turned back, his laugh low and mocking. His name was Ethan Carter, and he had the air of a tech startup founder, young, ambitious, with a smartwatch that beeped notifications incessantly. "Don't worry, she's probably used to fast food," he said, his voice dripping with amusement, eliciting a ripple of chuckles from nearby seats. Rachel's hand stilled on her water bottle. She looked up, her eyes meeting Olivia's for a brief moment. There was no plea in her gaze, just quiet resolve. "Water's fine," she said, her voice soft but firm, like a line drawn in the sand that dared anyone to cross it. Olivia blinked, caught off guard by the composure, then moved on, her heels clicking faster on the carpeted floor. Rachel leaned back, her fingers tapping once against the armrest, a small, controlled motion that released a fraction of the tension. She'd faced worse than this. In the cockpit, under enemy fire, with alarms blaring and fuel running low, she'd stayed calm. This was child's play, but it stung, reminding her of the isolation that came with her secrets. Hours passed, the cabin settling into a rhythm of clinking glasses, murmured conversations, and the occasional ding of the call button. Rachel sipped her water sparingly, her movements precise, like someone trained to conserve resources in survival mode. Richard Hale kept glancing her way, his eyes narrowing as if trying to place her, to figure out why she didn't react like he expected. Finally, unable to contain his curiosity, or perhaps his need to assert dominance, he spoke, his voice thick with condescension. "You look like you're headed to a job interview or something. Hope you've got a better outfit in that bag." Rachel turned her head, just enough to meet his eyes, her gaze unflinching. "I'm good," she said, her voice low and steady, like a blade sliding into its sheath, precise, unyielding. Richard blinked, thrown off by the quiet confidence, then muttered something about kids these days, and buried himself in his tablet, his fingers tapping aggressively. Rachel turned back to the window, her face unreadable, but her fingers brushed the edge of her seatbelt, adjusting it slightly as the plane hit a pocket of turbulence. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, smooth and reassuring. Folks were making a quick stop at Andrews Air Force Base for refueling. Shouldn't be long. Rachel's head lifted slightly, her eyes sharpening as she glanced out at the approaching military runway. Jets lined the tarmac, F-22 Raptors, their sleek shapes glinting under the afternoon sun like predators at rest. Personnel moved with purpose below, their uniforms a sea of camouflage and flight suits. Her fingers tightened around her water bottle for a second before she set it down. Andrews wasn't just any stop, it was a place where her past echoed loudly. Olivia, standing nearby adjusting an overhead bin, noticed the shift in Rachel's posture, the subtle straightening of her spine, the focused gaze. "Something catch your eye?" Olivia asked, her tone more suspicious than curious, as if Rachel had no right to be interested. Rachel didn't answer right away. She kept looking out, her hand still in her lap, like she was seeing ghosts on the runway, old comrades, lost missions. As the plane descended, Ethan Carter stood to retrieve his bag from the overhead bin. He glanced at Rachel, then spoke loudly to no one in particular, his voice carrying a smug edge. "Some people don't know their place, do they?" He said it with the confidence of someone used to power plays, drawing nods from a few passengers, their smiles tight and knowing. Rachel's eyes flicked to him for a moment before returning to the window. She shifted in her seat, her backpack sliding slightly against her leg. "I know where I am," she said. Her voice, so quiet it barely reached him, but the weight of it made him pause, his hand freezing on his bag. He cleared his throat, suddenly interested in his carry-on, and sat down without another word. The cabin grew quieter, the air thick with unspoken tension, the engine's whine the only sound breaking the silence. Mark Ellison, the loud one with the loosened tie, leaned over his seat. He had that grin again, the kind that said he thrived on attention. "What? You want to fly a plane?" he barked, his laugh sharp and mean, encouraging chuckles from nearby seats. Rachel turned her head slowly, her dark eyes locking onto his with an intensity that made his grin falter. "I've worked near planes before," she said, her voice calm but firm, like a door clicking shut on further discussion. Mark shifted in his seat, his bravado deflating as he found his drink suddenly fascinating, swirling the ice cubes with a straw. Olivia raised an eyebrow but said nothing, moving down the aisle with her heels clicking sharply as if marking the end of the exchange. When the plane touched down at Andrews, the cabin's energy shifted. The business-class passengers perked up, adjusting their jackets, checking their phones, as if stepping into a VIP lounge. Olivia's voice came over the intercom, crisp and professional. A few select passengers had been invited to meet the F-22 pilots on the tarmac. "Please remain seated unless you've been notified." She glanced at Rachel, her eyes making it clear who wasn't on the list. Rachel didn't move. She took another sip of water, her face blank, like she'd heard variations of this exclusion her whole life. Her fingers brushed the edge of her backpack, where the faded eagle patch caught the light for a moment before she tucked it out of sight. That patch was from her first squadron, sewn on after a grueling training that left her bruised but unbreakable. Tara Wells leaned toward Claire, her voice loud enough to carry. "They probably don't want pictures with someone dressed like that," she said, her laugh sharp and practiced, drawing a nod from Claire, whose lips curled into a smirk. Ethan Carter, scrolling through his phone, smirked visibly, his thumb pausing on a social media feed. Rachel didn't look up. She screwed the cap back on her water bottle, her movements slow and deliberate, measuring the moment like a pilot calculating fuel burn. The cabin felt heavier now, the air thick with judgment that didn't need words to wound. As the invited passengers gathered their things, Jessica Lang paused by Rachel's row. Her perfume was sharp and floral, overwhelming in the confined space. She looked down at Rachel, her eyes narrowing slightly, and spoke to Olivia in a stage whisper. "You would think they'd screen people better for flights like this," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. Olivia nodded slightly, her lips pursed, and handed Jessica a complimentary drink, as if rewarding the comment. Rachel's hand stilled on her backpack, her fingers brushing the faded eagle patch. She looked up, her eyes meeting Jessica's for a split second. "Screening's not my problem," she said, her voice low and even, like a quiet challenge that hung in the air. Jessica froze, her drink halfway to her lips, then hurried back to her seat, her heels clacking awkwardly. Rachel leaned back, her expression unchanged, but her fingers tapped once against the armrest, a release valve for the pressure. Her eyes flicked to the window, where the F-22 stood like sentinels on the tarmac. For a moment, her fingers paused, hovering over the patch on her backpack. She'd sewn it on herself years ago, after a mission that left her hands shaking but her squadron alive. The memory flooded in, a night sky lit by tracer fire, the roar of engines blending with explosions below. She'd been the lead pilot, call sign Midnight Viper, guiding 3 squadrons through enemy territory. The radio had crackled with panic, but her voice had stayed steady, issuing commands that turned chaos into survival. They made it back, every plane, but the cost was high. A friend lost, her jet riddled with holes. Major Kyle Bennett stepped into the business class cabin, his presence like a storm rolling in. He was in his late 30s, with a jawline carved from stone and eyes that missed nothing, piercing blue, scanning the rows like radar. His uniform was sharp, insignia gleaming under the cabin lights. He greeted the invited passengers with polite nods, shaking hands with Richard Hale and Tara Wells, his grip firm but brief. But then his eyes landed on Rachel, sitting quietly in 12F. He froze, his hand still gripping the last handshake, his posture shifting from formal to reverent. The cabin didn't notice at first. The chatter continued. Glasses clinked, but Rachel did. She met his gaze, her expression steady, as if she'd been expecting this moment. Her fingers brushed the edge of her seat, a small grounding motion amid the surprise. Bennett walked straight to her row, his boots thudding heavily against the floor, drawing eyes now. "Are you Shadow Hawk 12?" he asked, his voice low, almost whisper-soft with respect. Rachel gave a small nod, her eyes never leaving his, a silent acknowledgement of shared history. Richard Hale snorted softly, like he thought it was a joke, his eyebrows raised in skepticism. Bennett's jaw tightened, but he didn't look away from Rachel. "My apologies for having you sit here," he said louder now, so the whole cabin could hear, his tone carrying authority that silenced the murmurs. "You're invited to the tarmac immediately." Rachel stood, slinging her backpack over one shoulder with smooth, precise movements, like she'd done this 100 times in gear far heavier. The cabin buzzed with whispers, confusion rippling through the seats, but she didn't look back, her steps measured as she followed Bennett toward the exit. As they passed, Mark Ellison leaned out of his seat, his watch glinting under the lights. "This has to be a mistake," he said, his voice loud and confident, like addressing a skeptical investor. "She doesn't look like anyone important." A few passengers nodded, their murmurs growing louder, a chorus of doubt. Rachel's steps didn't falter, but her hand tightened on her backpack strap, knuckles whitening for a moment. She turned her head slightly, her eyes meeting his with that same unflinching calm. "Looks can be deceiving," she said, her voice soft but sharp, like a blade slipping through silk cutting through. His bluster. Mark's mouth opened, then closed, his confidence deflating. He sat back, avoiding eyes, as Bennett's gaze flicked to him, a silent warning that needed no words. Bennett led Rachel out, the door opening to the sharp air of the tarmac, laced with jet fuel and wind. Outside, the sun beat down on the asphalt, heat waves shimmering off the F-22s. The pilots stood in a straight line, their uniforms crisp, faces unreadable, stoic professionals who lived for the skies. Bennett's voice cut through the silence like a command. "Attention! This is Midnight Viper, the one who once led 3 squadrons through enemy skies." The pilots snapped to attention, their hands rising in perfect unison to salute her, boots stomping in sync. Rachel returned the salute, her movements crisp and instinctive, her expression calm but with a warmth that softened her features. A faint smile tugged at her lips as she lowered her hand, the wind whipping her ponytail slightly. The wind carried the moment, and back in the plane, the cabin windows filled with faces, wide-eyed, pressed against the glass, watching the spectacle unfold. Rachel's eyes flicked to the jets, and for a brief second, her shoulders softened, like she was home among the machines that had defined her life. Back on the plane, the mood had shifted from smug to stunned. Richard Hale scoffed, leaning back with crossed arms. "Sounds like a Hollywood story," he said, his voice carrying over the hum of the idling engines, trying to rally the doubt. Olivia gave a forced chuckle, smoothing her uniform with nervous hands. "Maybe it's just an honorary title," she added, her voice lacking its earlier edge, glancing at the window uncertainly. Claire Donovan whispered to Tara, "No way it's real," her tone laced with envy now, rather than mockery. Rachel didn't hear them. She was on the tarmac, the jet's shadows stretching long. Bennett's glance toward the cabin was cold, like he'd overheard every skeptical word, his loyalty to her unwavering. A young officer approached, carrying an old flight helmet, worn but meticulously kept, the leather scuffed from use. The call sign Midnight Viper was embroidered in bold, faded letters across the side. Bennett took it and held it out to Rachel. "This helmet is only awarded to a pilot who's completed a top-secret mission," he said, his voice steady but loud enough for the cabin to hear through the open door. Rachel took the helmet, her fingers tracing the stitching with a reverence that spoke volumes. Memories flooded back. The mission where she'd earned it, flying low over hostile territory, evading missiles by inches, delivering a payload that turned the tide of a covert operation. She slipped it on, the fit perfect, as natural as breathing. It felt like slipping back into her old self. A young pilot, barely out of his 20s with a fresh face under his cap, stepped forward, his voice low with awe. "She's the one who saved my squadron," he said, his words carrying to the line of pilots. They straightened further, their faces shifting to something like awe, recognition of a legend in their midst. As Rachel stood there, a junior pilot approached hesitantly, holding a small, weathered logbook, its edges frayed from years of flights. "Ma'am, you signed this for me 3 years ago," he said, his voice cracking slightly with emotion. He opened it to a page marked with her call sign, her signature sharp and unmistakable, a looping R she'd practiced in downtime. The other pilots turned, their eyes softening with recognition, whispers rippling through the ranks. Rachel took the logbook, her fingers brushing the page gently. She nodded, her lips pressing into a small, genuine smile, the first real one of the flight. "You made it through," she said, her voice quiet but warm, like a mentor proud of her protege. The cabin windows were still crowded with faces, but the air felt different now, heavier with something unspoken. Rachel stepped back into the cabin, the helmet tucked under her arm. The passengers were quieter, but not all were convinced. Olivia forced a smile, her voice overly polite. "Well, it's nice to have a special guest," she said, but her eyes flicked to Rachel's scuffed sneakers, betraying her skepticism. Ethan Carter crossed his arms, his voice low but clear. "Probably just a PR stunt," he muttered, trying to regain some footing. Rachel didn't respond. She bowed her head slightly, her fingers brushing the edge of the helmet, and settled back into 12F, her backpack at her feet. She looked out the window, the jets still visible, gleaming under the sun. As the plane prepared for takeoff, a younger flight attendant approached Rachel's row with a nervous smile. She held a small pin, a silver eagle, and offered it to Rachel. "This is from the crew for, your service," she said, her voice stumbling over the words. The cabin grew quiet, all eyes on the exchange. Rachel looked at the pin, then at the attendant's face. She took it, her fingers careful, and pinned it to her backpack without a word. The attendant smiled, a real one this time, and hurried back to her station. Ethan Carter shifted in his seat, his earlier smirk gone. Rachel leaned back, her eyes on the window, the pin glinting faintly in the cabin light. The plane taxied back to the runway, preparing for takeoff. Rachel's fingers tapped lightly against the helmet in her lap, a slow, steady rhythm. The captain's voice came over the intercom, but before he could finish, another sound cut through, a low, powerful roar. 2 F-22s appeared alongside the plane, their wings glinting in the sunlight. Bennett's voice crackled over the radio, clear for everyone to hear. "Midnight Viper, we never got a thank you for last time." Rachel leaned toward the window, her lips curving into a small smile. She pressed the headset she'd been given and spoke, her voice steady. "Hold formation, Eagle 1. The response came instantly, a chorus of voices over the radio. "Yes, ma'am." The cabin went silent. Richard Hale froze, his drink halfway to his mouth. Tara Wells stared at her phone, her finger still. Olivia's smile vanished, her hands fumbling with a tray. No one spoke. The F-22 stayed in formation, escorting the plane as it climbed into the sky. Rachel leaned back, her eyes on the jets outside. The cabin was a different place now. No one looked at her the same way. Mark Ellison shifted uncomfortably, his earlier bravado gone. Claire Donovan whispered something to Tara, but it was too quiet to hear. Rachel didn't need to hear it. She'd heard enough. As the plane leveled off, a passenger in a tailored jacket stood and approached Rachel's row, his face flushed with embarrassment. I didn't know who you were," he stammered, his voice low but audible. "I'm sorry for what I said earlier." Rachel looked up, her eyes steady but not unkind. She nodded once, a small acknowledging gesture, and turned back to the window. The man stood there for a moment, his hands fidgeting, before returning to his seat. The cabin felt smaller now, the air charged with a mix of awe and shame. Rachel's fingers brushed the eagle pin on her backpack, a quiet reminder of who she was. The flight to D.C. felt shorter after that. The cabin stayed quiet, the earlier chatter replaced by an uneasy hum. Rachel kept her eyes on the window, watching the F-22's peel away Ain approached its final descent. Her fingers brushed the patch on her backpack again, the faded eagle catching the light. She'd been 19 when she earned it, flying a mission so classified even her team didn't know the full scope. The sky had been chaos, the radio screaming with orders, but she brought them home. Every single one. When the plane landed, the passengers moved slowly, like they were still processing what they'd seen. Rachel stood, slinging her backpack over her shoulder, the helmet tucked under her arm. She didn't rush or linger, just walked down the aisle, her step steady, her head high. Richard Hale avoided her eyes, his phone pressed to his ear as he muttered about a meeting. Tara Wells typed furiously, her face pale. Olivia stood by the exit, her smile forced, her hands clasped tightly. At the gate, a man was waiting, tall, quiet, with a presence that didn't need words. His suit was simple but tailored, and his eyes locked onto Rachel the moment she appeared. He didn't say much, just nodded and fell into step beside her. The passengers from the flight, lingering at baggage claim, went quiet. Ethan Carter dropped his phone mid-text, his smirk gone. Claire Donovan looked away, clutching her scarf tightly. No one needed to say his name. They knew who he was. James Monroe, Rachel's husband, a man whose influence reached places most couldn't imagine. Before they left the terminal, a young girl, maybe 10, tugged at her mother's sleeve and pointed at Rachel. "Is that the pilot lady?" she whispered, her eyes wide with wonder. The mother, a quiet woman who'd stayed silent during the flight, looked at Rachel and nodded. "That's her," she said softly, her voice full of respect. Rachel caught the girl's eye and gave a small, warm smile, the kind that said she saw her. The girl grinned back, clutching her mother's hand tighter. Rachel's hand brushed James as they walked on, the helmet still under her arm, the eagle pin glinting faintly. The terminal was busy, but people parted as they passed, like they could sense something bigger than the faded hoodie and scuffed sneakers. The consequences came quickly, quiet but relentless. Richard Hale, the mid-level manager at a defense contractor, found himself out of a job by the next morning. Someone on the flight had recorded his comments, and the video spread online like wildfire, his LinkedIn profile scrubbed clean. Tara Wells, the influencer, saw her latest sponsorship deal canceled after the video went viral, her followers dropping by thousands overnight, her apology post buried under a flood of comments. Olivia Hart faced a formal reprimand from the airline for unprofessional conduct, reassigned to short domestic routes, her dreams of international flights grounded. Jessica Lang's company distanced itself from her, citing unprofessional behavior, her social media presence taking a hit. Ethan Carter's startup lost a major investor, the news breaking quietly but decisively. Claire Donovan's law firm issued a public apology, sidelining her from high-profile cases. Mark Ellison's consulting firm dropped him, his name erased from their website by week's end. Rachel didn't see any of this unfold. She didn't need to. She'd been through worse than their words. Missions where the sky was fire, where one wrong move meant no coming back. This was just noise, the kind she'd learned to tune out long ago. She and James walked through the terminal, their steps in sync, the helmet still under her arm. The D.C. skyline loomed outside, A reminder of why she was here. Not for the passengers, not for recognition, but for something bigger, something that had always driven her, even when the world tried to make her small. In the end, Rachel stood at the edge of the tarmac, her husband beside her, the city stretching out before them. The wind tugged at her hoodie, but she didn't pull it tighter. She stood steady, like she'd always been. The world had doubted her, mocked her, tried to make her feel she didn't belong. But she wasn't small. She never had been. And for anyone who's ever been judged, overlooked, or silenced, her story is a quiet promise. You're not alone. You never were. So, where are you watching from? Drop a comment below and let me know what the story stirred in you. Hit that like button if Rachel's strength inspired you. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe to the Jones Life Stories for more tales of heartbreak, betrayal, and healing. Let's keep walking this journey together, proving that no matter how the world sees you, your story is worth telling.